My name is Kayla Wells. I am a graduate student at Kansas State University in Agriculture Communications, and I am in the Outcome Theory 844 class with Dr. Lori Baker in fall of 2014. And this is my in-depth theory analysis over the gatekeeping theory, which has become an essential theory in communication studies. To start off, we are going to look at a brief history of the gatekeeping theory. The term gatekeeping was coined by German social psychologist Kurt Lewin, who was alive from 1890 to 1947. His life work studied concepts of life that directly impacted a person's attitude in what made up their own world and how that influenced behavior. He described gatekeeping as essentially blocking unwanted things by using a gate, and how those gates opened or closed to allow information to pass through those channels. He also specifically used this to relate to food. And how he related it to food was that the wife or a mother of a household was generally considered the gatekeeper that decided what kind of food ended up on the table and in the home. Originally, this theory was widely used in the field of psychology. However, it has become an essential theory in communication in the years since Lewin's studies. Continuing with gatekeeping's history, it is important to go ahead and summarize what exactly gatekeeping means in today's modern society. Gatekeeping is how information passes through gates, and then gatekeepers are those who allow that message to pass through those channels. For example, news stations and journalists tend to only select portions of a story that they wish to share with the public and actually get published. So a news station or a journalist would be considered a gatekeeper. Gatekeepers are also those that make decisions about what kind of information is diffused into society. In my research, I found that the best example of this is political diffusion. That is a great example of gatekeepers. And furthermore, editors are also a modern-day example of what it means to be a gatekeeper in the media genre specifically, as they determine what kind of information is put into print. Lewin's gatekeeping theory suggests that circumstances affect what facts journalists will select for their story. In some cases, this is seen through story framing, which is where journalists and reporters alike will select only specific facts that they wish to share with the public and release that information. In a journal article that I discovered in my research, David Collier speaks very frankly on this, and in this direct quote, his article states, "The theory encompasses the whole news judgment process, from discovery to transmission, including the reporting and writing stages." How this is broken down, and the point that he is trying to make, is that gatekeeping remains in the entire process from gathering the facts to when it is actually published. Editors, reporters, and journalists are writing and framing everything about their story around the idea of only wanting specific facts to be released to the public. In some cases, this is seen through censorship. The concept of the gatekeeping theory can be broken down in the gatekeeping model that I found in my research. Step number 1 is that information moves step by step through channels. The number of channels can vary, as can the amount of time in each channel will also vary. Essentially, this information that moves step by step is what is being determined by the gatekeeper. In step number 2, information must then pass through a gate in order to move from one channel to the next. Again, the gatekeeper must then decide what information they are going to allow to continue and then be released to the public. Step number 3 is that forces govern channels. There may be opposing psychological forces causing conflict, which creates resistance to movement through the channel. These forces that govern channels are most often the gatekeepers. For example, a news editor is the one that is going to determine what kind of information they wish to move through one channel to the next. In step number 4, it is stated that there may be several channels that lead to the same end result. This might be one of the most interesting parts of the gatekeeping theory, is that even when there is just one gatekeeper, there are still many different ways and variety of channels that information can end up in the same spot. And in step number 5, different actors may control the channels and act as gatekeepers at different times. In this model that's in the lower right-hand corner of this slide, all of these steps are broken down into an illustration. You'll see the multiple channels that will travel through the same gate, and then the information will ultimately be released. Gatekeeping was originally used widely in psychology, which was previously discussed in earlier slides about how Kurt Lewin, who was a social psychologist himself, was the one that actually coined the gatekeeping theory phrase. Today, however, this theory has become essential in communication and media. David Manning White of the University of Iowa began the research for gatekeeping in media in 1949. In his studies, he found that selection decisions in newspapers were extremely influential and thought out. It's already been touched on in previous slides that gatekeepers, especially those in media such as news editors and anchors and journalists and reporters, will select only specific facts to actually release to the public. And as Manning White's studies show, all of those decisions are not without extreme thought behind it. Manning White's study created the following levels of gatekeeping in media. How these are broken down is different ways to explain why things are covered the way that they are. To start with, there are individuals. Manning White describes this as when decisions are personal, meaning that one person or a group of individuals are making personal choices about what kind of information they wish to reveal. Then, there are routine practices of communication work, which is when decisions are made according to a pre-established set of rules. So essentially, to break this down, is that there are a pre-considered and a pre-established set of rules that a certain organization has to follow regardless of personal choice or ethics. Then there are communication organizations, and this exists within any social institution. So for example, the way that I look at this is if it is a news station, they will have a set of rules that the organization abides by, and that is how things are to be covered. Then there are social institutions. Generally, this is when events tend to have an impact on how things are going to be covered. And finally, in my opinion, one of the most interesting things in the gatekeeping levels of media is societies. And this is when culture plays a very specific role in how things are covered. What I find interesting about this is that different societies have different levels of censorship, which again goes back to the whole public right to know and privacy argument. But still, culture will play a very, very strong role in what kind of information the public needs to know and how different news stations or different media organizations will choose to reveal that information to the public eye. Gatekeeping and censorship often go hand in hand, and I see no greater example of this than in the news coverage that happened during and after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. David Collier's journal article speaks very frankly about this, and studies that have been done since then show undeniable bias and censorship of facts by U.S. journalists during and after those attacks. Coverage of 9/11 was also selective in what kind of images were shown to the public. In many cases, that was with very good reason, but still, there were gatekeepers making the decisions about what they wanted published on their own news station. Each station has its own level of gatekeeping and chose what kind of images and facts they wanted to have revealed and be discussed. Continuing with the 9/11 and war in Iraq example of how gatekeeping is in the media, I came across a study in my research done by the University of Colorado that is specifically related to the war in Iraq. They stated the following. The study found that the war journalists singled out personal judgment, an individual-level gatekeeping force, to be the most salient element in reporting the escalation period of the Iraq War. However, the journalists responded that financial constraints and deference to audience interest, organizational level, and social institutional level gatekeeping forces determined the direction and the volume of the war reporting more saliently during the de-escalation period of the Iraq War. In closing, not only does gatekeeping play a crucial role in how things are reported, but it also plays a role in how audiences view certain and specific issues. Another example of gatekeeping in the media is found in the American Quarter Horse Association's cloning lawsuit. This lawsuit was over being allowed to register clones with the AQHA's registry. To many, this was viewed as a violation of antitrust laws that has kept AQHA functioning for nearly 75 years. AQHA President John Dobbs and Vice President Don Treadway acted as gatekeepers in this situation. The lawsuit finally reached a verdict in 2013 to not register clones with the association. However, Dobbs and Treadway released statements about the association's stance on this subject, and throughout the entire lawsuit also released information that was very selective and in favor of AQHA's stance. This is an example of gatekeeping in the sense that two very important gatekeepers and who had high control in the association were those releasing statements to the public and hoped to help their stance be the final ruling. One of the biggest and main controversies surrounding the gatekeeping theory is the public's right to know. Censorship is not always widely accepted by the public, and many believe that the public deserve to know every single detail. As I mentioned earlier, censorship and gatekeeping often go hand in hand, as gatekeepers generally keep censorship rules in mind when deciding what types of details and information they are going to release to the public. Crime and criminal justice is one of the most common areas of public's right to know versus privacy arguments. Gatekeeping is seen commonly when reporting on crime in order to protect privacy. News stations, editors, and journalists all function under their organization's set of rules when it comes to what facts they are allowed to report on and release information about, especially when reporting on some type of a crime. And in many cases, they wish to stay conservative in how they report in order to protect the privacy of those involved. However, with the internet and mainstream media, it has made it harder for the journalist to be the only one acting as the gatekeeper, and there are many other channels opening to where information can be seen and released. Continuing with what was discussed in the previous slide, it is essentially a battle between access and gatekeeping, and that is where the controversy lies. Censorship plays a role in this simply because the public desires access to all facts. In many cases, news stations and media have to function under certain censorship rules, where then gatekeeping coincides. So, do gatekeepers have too much control and power in one location, especially in the field of journalism and news? That is one of the frequently talked about controversies related to gatekeeping, which then goes back to the public right to know versus privacy arguments. This is by far the most important slide in this entire presentation. How is gatekeeping being used in agricultural communications, which is a relatively new and emerging field in the genre of ag? I came across a USDA article and study from 2007 that talks about the need for more communication and information to be released from ag-related fields and to the general public and natural resources. While the study is somewhat dated, however, the message in the data still rings true in today's agricultural industry. There has been a significant gap between what the general public understands about agriculture and what agriculture is able to communicate. Generally, this gets lost in translation with significant terminology differences like GMOs or a heifer. But still, as gatekeepers for ag, it is our job in those gatekeepers' positions and duty to make sure that what is being released is information that the public is able to understand. I can find nor think of any better example of this than the Chipotle farming campaign. Chipotle farming organic farming campaign has taken a significant blow against agriculture, saying that how they do things is not ethical and not safe or healthy to ingest. The general public is often good at listening to significantly well thought out advertising campaigns, which Chipotle has had on their side. Gatekeeping falls perfectly into this because gatekeeping goes through several different channels. Chipotle has used a channel such as advertising to release the information that they want the public to know and help persuade them to think the way that they want to think. As agriculture communicators and gatekeepers, and in the research that I found specifically about the Chipotle organic farming campaign, it is important to use strategic communication to relay information to the public about what agriculture is. As a gatekeeper, opening up different channels that say different things about agriculture and in many cases educate is what will make a difference. Finally, in conclusion, the idea and concept of gatekeeping began with a social psychologist named Kurt Lewin, whose life studies and information has ultimately created one of the most essential theories in communication. Gatekeepers are given a unique opportunity to select and relay what types of information will be released to the public. But then, there is the question of, is this a negative thing, which is discussed in the controversy surrounding the theory. As news stations, journalists, editors, and reporters are able to select what types of facts they wish to release to the public and what channels they wish to open and allow certain information to pass through certain channels. The question was raised, does this affect the public's right to know? And finally, as agriculture communication continues to grow, so does the theory of gatekeeping. There has been that gap between the general public and those in the field of agriculture, which is seen in the Chipotle organic farming campaign. And as gatekeepers in ag, it is important to continue to open those channels to educate the general public on what agriculture truly is. I appreciate your time. My name is Kayla Wells, and this is my in-depth theory analysis on the gatekeeping theory. Thank you very much.